Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Upbuilding the Self. This is Michael Sloyer, and I am here with Rasanath and Hari Prasad. Hey, guys.
Hello. Hey.
It's great to be with you both, and it is great to be starting a little mini series for our podcast. We're going to be doing a little series on nonviolent communication, which is a framework that we use at Upbuild often in our coaching. It's something we've shared over the years in our programming. It's something that I know I use a lot in my own personal life. I know that both of you have also shared that you use it in your personal life. And so throughout the series, we're going to cover different teachings from the framework. And today we'll start with an introduction on the framework and then get into one of the core teachings of needs versus strategies. So really looking forward to the time together today and the series throughout.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
Thank you both for being here. So Hari, this is something that you brought to the fore in terms of an idea for the podcast. You've also taken a course and been trained in nonviolent communication. So it would be great to start with you. If you could share a little bit of background on the framework and why you feel so passionate about it.
Yeah, well, I recognized that a lot of my communication and the communication that I was observing of others didn't fully satisfy me. And the reason is because I felt like I can easily get triggered and trigger other people. And I wasn't able to really penetrate as to what was going on and what to do about it. And so I signed myself up for a course in nonviolent communication. And my biggest aim, it was twofold, but my biggest aim was to show up better in my relationship with my wife, Radha Bhakti, because I felt like when we were having conflicts, there was something missing in my approach, and that I hoped also could be valuable for her by modeling it and by sharing whatever I was learning to the extent that she was interested. But really, more than anything, just to show her that I care and that I'm willing to do whatever I can to lessen the difficulty and to put my best foot forward. And it's not that we were in any kind of crisis or there was a huge urgency, but there would be times where I felt like the conflict was stronger than it needed to be. And I know she felt that a lot. And so I felt like, why should I just permit that? I need to do something about this. And so the second reason was because I felt that this is so tightly tied to our work. We have a workshop called Communicating Across Barriers. So we're teaching people to communicate across barriers and difficulties. And that's just one. I mean, there's so many things that we emphasize in communication. It's vital. And I was also trained by our marriage mentor, Krishnanandini Devi, who we've had speak at Upbuild about the importance of communication, that so much of our satisfaction and dissatisfaction is about our communication. So I thought, okay, I'm going to bring this into Upbuild. I can see how, as you mentioned, Michael, coaching clients really need this. And in our programming, the participants need this. And starting with me, I need this.
Beautiful. Thank you. And so what is the framework?
Yeah, it's a framework that was developed by Marshall Rosenberg, who was quite a luminary. He passed in, I don't remember, it's in the 2010s. But he had this strong realization that there's been wisdom throughout the ages that will help us to better connect with one another, starting with ourselves. Just like I was saying, I know I need to start with myself. And so he felt that if we were self-aware, then we would be able to figure out what's going on in us and be able to show up very differently and authentically And connection is a two-way street. If I'm not connected with myself, how could I possibly connect with anybody else? So that's foundational. And then once I'm connected with myself, I want to get to know the other person, and I want them to be connected with themselves and to share with me what's going on. And even if they're not as connected with themselves, I can start from my side to help them connect with themselves by figuring out what's going on in them. He would always ask this question, what's alive in you? What's alive in you? That was like his signature question, because I want to know you and I want to feel what you're feeling. And if I can feel what you're feeling, then we're connected. Because I always talk about how relationship is not a series of interactions, what to speak of transactions. Relationship is an exchange of emotions. So understanding this, Marshall Rosenberg was trying to enhance our connection with one another by getting to know what's going on inside us. What are the emotions and what's behind the emotions? And he created this nonviolent communication framework, synthesizing the wisdom that he had come across from different traditions and creating a language, really a very powerful language for connection. And the term nonviolent communication, which we can talk more about, is to reduce the barriers to connection. Again, communicating across barriers. He was really on the same wavelength. Reduce the barriers to connection, and connection is natural. So violence is not needed in our communication.
So just to reflect back what you've shared, it sounds like your motivation for learning about this framework was twofold, both to improve the connection and empathy that was present in your marriage with your wife, and then also to bring it into our work at Upbuild, whether it's with coaching clients or in our workshops, again, because of how important connection is across any type of communication. And then,
sorry, yeah. I'll just interject that if I couldn't do it in my marriage, then I have not very much business that in our work. So I thought that they would naturally feed each other nicely.
Beautiful. Yeah, I appreciate that a lot. And that also speaks to one of our core philosophies at Upbuild, that no one should be a coach unless they're also receiving coaching, how we need to be on the field with our clients, doing the work alongside them.
Much appreciated.
And then really at the center of this framework is the need for connection. And you didn't use this word, but you were describing it, empathy, to be able to really understand what other people are feeling and be able to relate to them on that level of feeling. Okay, Rasanath, let's get you involved here. The framework is called Nonviolent Communication, which means we are trying to make our communication not violent. How is our communication normally violent?
So when we use the term violence, it is very jarring because for most of us, we don't necessarily consider ourselves to be violent people. And yet we have experienced times when we get triggered and we respond in ways that are hurtful and unkind. Right? So when we talk about nonviolent communication, or for that matter, violent communication, the origins behind any sort of hurtful, harsh communication is when we get triggered. And so understanding triggers becomes a very important piece in being able to communicate from a place of compassion and empathy, which is essentially what nonviolent communication is all about. So that to me is the foundation here, separating our responses from our triggers. So, and triggers are connected to needs. We'll come to that. There is a whole hierarchy here. But when we usually, and this is something that we have covered in other topics too, when I think Vipin speaks extensively about it in the traffic lights, and he talks about, how to hit the pause button before we respond to a stimulus, right? It's
the emotional traffic light that he
gives. Emotional traffic lights. Yeah. So the many times we are so identified with our response the trigger and the response just become one unit. And we don't really necessarily spend time understanding how we are triggered and how we can respond from that place. So this is not to say that we don't get triggered or we will never get triggered. This is, again, another way of becoming very highly acutely aware of what the triggers are and why they exist in a particular relationship or in a particular communication, and then choosing to respond in a way that elicits more understanding rather than creating more misunderstanding. And again, this is a characteristic of violent communication, that violent communication has the potential to create misunderstandings very quickly. It's a cascade effect. The origin is also some level of misunderstanding, and the response then just deepens the misunderstanding even further. So going back to how when we recognize our triggers and then make a choice of how we need to respond in a way that is more compassionate, then we also reduce dramatically the misunderstandings that can occur.
Okay, and you said most people don't identify as violent.
Yes.
Which is true, and I agree with. And how, if I'm sitting here and I'm listening to this podcast, and I know I get triggered, and I know I respond in an unkind and sometimes not so compassionate way, but I still don't see that as violent. What should I be seeing so that I can see how this framework applies to me?
Thank you. Violence is when somebody is hurt by what we say or how we behave. Right? That creates violence. Very fundamentally, if we were to understand what violence is, that's what violence is. As an example, last week, I made a sarcastic comment about my wife. It was with respect to, she was talking about and this was we landed in this conversation in a very unexpected way. She was just talking about how she misquoted her salary number. My salary was actually taken to be her salary, and she was just sharing how, wow, I wonder what it'll be like that to get that kind of salary. And then so I made a comment that was very stinging. And then at night she came and asked me, like, that hurt. Like, I don't understand why you said that. And I was just sharing something, and I had to like really pause and like look at, well, why did I say what I said? So the reason why I use this example is because sometimes we may even be making jokes. Sometimes we say, oh, I was just half joking. Sometimes we use sarcasm. And sometimes we're just outrightly strong. And in all of these cases, the person on the other side who's receiving the communication can feel hurt. And we have all done that.
Right.
We have hurt someone. And we have hurt someone. The origins of hurting someone also lies in the fact that we have been hurt in some way. Right. So this is something that we have to understand, even when we say we are not violent people, that we do exhibit behaviors that are violent, ultimately because our behavior or our words can hurt people. And we have potentially done that several times in our life.
Sure. Okay, great. So there's something, first of all, thank you for sharing that example, which felt vulnerable and was obviously very fresh for you in your relationship, and it was illuminating for us. So thank you for that. And I'm seeing here we can be violent in a way that feels more obvious with something like sarcasm. And obviously there are different levels of sarcasm. It can be extremely stinging and obviously hurtful, or it can be much more subtle. And then there are also ways of communicating where we might not be doing something like sarcasm, but still we're expressing things in a way that can be ultimately hurtful or somehow controlling of the other person in some way. And we would also classify that as violent communication. Hari, anything you would add to this discussion?
Anytime we're not interested in creating connection, there's a violence to it because we're creating a disconnect, actually. Connection is natural. We're all interconnected. So connection is natural. But when we want to create disconnect consciously or unconsciously, there's a violence to it. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't need boundaries. This doesn't mean that like we should be hugging a tiger of a person. That's not the idea. But the idea is when I create a block that is based on some kind of selfish motivation. Now, nonviolent communication doesn't go into selfishness. This is more our understanding of the ego versus the self, and the ego being very selfish and the self being embracing of others and feeling that interconnection. So this is our angle on nonviolent communication. But when there's a selfishness that is not actually constructive, that is not actually serving the real me or anybody else, that's when things become violent. And I need to be very, very mindful of that. Because if I'm mindful of that, then I can remove those blocks and create connection, which is natural and which is the purpose of the framework. In fact, Marshall Rosenberg would talk about this. He would say, if you don't like, the negation of something, fine. I also am not so interested in negating something, he would talk about. Then call it compassionate communication. Compassionate communication is the same thing. That's the actual purpose. But nonviolent communication has a way of grabbing your attention and feeling like it's adding something new to the mix as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it has a way of grabbing your attention. It also, I've heard from people that it feels like not a great name for something that is supposed to be very attractive for people and actually has so many incredible teachings, as we'll see over the next few episodes.
Yeah, that's right. Some people think there's violence in the naming of it. We have to understand that there's a place for calling ourselves out and for humbling ourselves and actually provoking and grabbing our attention like that.
Yeah, that's great. And one thing that I was
Marshall Rosenberg would also say this is not about like being nice. It's not we're not here like trying to be super nice to each other. That's not the point. The point is to be real and to be connected. And that means like we have stuff that we have to work through. So when we call ourselves out on these things, or when we are sharing, even like if we're sarcastic in some way, if it's intentional, if it's guided by a desire to create a deeper connection, or if I'm responsible for somebody and I need to guide them in some way, then there's more leeway. It's all about the consciousness. That's what we have to remember. It's all about the consciousness. It's not about the thing itself.
Okay, and I also wanted to share one, as I was prepping for this conversation and thinking about violent communication, I just wanted to share one example, which I also shared with you guys right before we started recording, that helps to illuminate some of the violence that we might not see in our communication. So there's a very common communication between partners or people at work, something like, I need you to spend more time with me. And on the surface, that might feel very nonviolent and harmless. But depending on our consciousness, as you said, and depending on how we say that, there could be a type of violence to something like that, because I might be trying to communicate that I want you to feel guilty as a result of not spending so much time with me, or that there'll be consequences if you don't actually change your schedule or change your behavior in some way to spend more time with me. So these are the subtle things we want to be looking out for, where we're trying to induce feelings of fear or guilt or shame or some other emotions in somebody else that we ourselves might not be so aware of when we're communicating. And yeah. I think, sorry, go ahead, Hari.
No, please continue.
I was going to move us into the first
Okay.
teaching. So please go ahead.
I was just going to say that we also have to be aware, and this is a vital part of the nonviolent communication framework. I don't get to choose what you feel, nor do I get to blame you for what I feel. You see, it works both ways because I don't get to choose what you feel. You're free. You have free will. You can feel what you feel independent of me. Therefore, I also can't then turn around and say, you made me feel this way and blame you for it. So there's a recognition of free will and a recognition of the tendency to blame other people for how they made us feel in a victim mindset. And NVC, as we shorten it to NVC, is meant to take us out of that victim mindset, to honor our free will, the free will of others, and to acknowledge that I may have felt a certain way because of what you said or in reaction to what you said, but that doesn't mean that you made me feel this way. I may have intended to make you feel a certain way and I may have been successful, but that's because there was some cooperation there in the sense that I went with it. I went with what you made me feel or what you wanted to make me feel. I went with it.
Okay, very good. So let us move into now one of I would say this is, for me, the most important distinction of nonviolent communication, or I would say the one that I find most accessible and used most frequently. And that is the distinction between needs and strategies. So, Hari, could you share what is this distinction between needs and strategies?
Yeah, so needs and strategies are part of our everyday life all the time. It's constantly in motion. There's never a time where we're not experiencing a need. In fact, at all times we're experiencing an abundance of needs, an overwhelming abundance of needs. And therefore, we have all kinds of strategies that we're playing out. So what is a need? A need, as Marshall Rosenberg defines it, is life energy seeking fulfillment. Life energy seeking fulfillment. It's something in us that is demanding to be recognized and to be fulfilled. And that when it is fulfilled, it gives us that energy that we are seeking and that we're made of. And a strategy is our attempt to meet a need. So that is the surface level action or subtle mindset that we think is going to help us meet a need. And we're either right or we're wrong, or we're somewhere in between. There's a spectrum of how much a need can be met or how little it can be met.
So we have the definition of a need as life energy seeking fulfillment. It's something within us that gives us energy. And then the strategy is more on the superficial level, something that we think will help us meet that need. And we may be right
strategies
that
are important. Strategies are important. They're just more external as compared with the depth of the need.
That's very helpful. Okay. And so what are some examples of needs?
Yeah. So a need is anything which is intrinsically valuable and motivating. And there's such a gamut of them. So one need is for autonomy. Another need is for mutuality. Another need is for intimacy. The need that connects all of them really is for connection. It's all about being connected with myself and connected with one another. And different needs will help me experience that more. So if I neglect one need, that's going to get in the way of my feeling connected to myself and others. So there's so many needs, but they have to be intrinsically valuable, intrinsically constructive. And there's a way in which, I can never meet them enough. In other words, if you're really touching on a need, it's kind of always motivating and always energizing. I can never exhaust a need. It's just that good. It's not like, oh yeah, you know what? That's too much intimacy, or that's too much security I'm experiencing right now. Too much security may mean that I've neglected something else, like adventure. We have a need for adventure, right? But that's not because I have too much security. I can have the same amount of security and not neglect my need for adventure. But when we pit these needs against each other, we do something artificial. That actually they're all living in us. They're all present and pushing us to meet them in different ways. And we prioritize them differently. And each person will prioritize them differently and in different life stages or circumstances that will happen. But they're all inherently motivating all the time to varying degrees. And we can never have too much of them. We can just have more of one at the cost of another.
I'm noticing for myself, as you started sharing some of the different examples of needs, that there are certain needs that feel more exciting for me and I feel like are higher in my priority list, and then others which are, I know I have them, but I don't pay much attention to. And actually, I'm much more okay with not having so many strategies to meet those needs.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and that is both an indication of the fact that you're an individual and you're in a particular part of your life and in a particular mindset right now, as well as an indication that perhaps there are some things which we've decided we're okay to neglect. And it would be interesting to examine what is the effect of that.
Okay. As much as I would love to have a psychoanalysis session right now, maybe we should keep going with the framework.
We all do this. And the Enneagram personality typology that we use also talks about how, like, when we talk about the dimension of the instincts, there's something in us which we're prioritizing, which we need, and there's something in us that we need, which we're deprioritizing, and there's a cost to it, which we're not aware of. So that applies very much here with NVC, that there are insights that come when we see, like, okay, you know what, I'm naturally geared in this direction. That's good. And what might I be missing?
Right. And just to bring our listeners into that, all of us here at Upbuild, I think I could say all of us, we neglect our need for comfort and quite a bit. And that results in us needing to go to the bathroom for far longer than one should normally need to go to the bathroom.
That's right.
And we often see that when we get together.
Oh, yeah.
Good. Rasanath, anything you would share before we move into the strategy part?
The only thing I wanted to state was, based on what you said, Michael, that certain needs feel more acute and then certain needs don't feel as acute. There is a way, based on experiences, based on what we bring into this life, there are needs that even when they are being met with, we still feel that we need more of it. And then there are needs that even when they're not being met with, I feel like, well, I can do without this. So that's something to keep in mind. The second thing, which is also the very acute way in which our current lifestyle works, is that I feel like in order to meet certain needs, I have to neglect certain others. Like, there is a way in which I feel like the price that I have to pay in order to meet certain needs is the neglecting of certain other needs. And that creates an imbalance. That just does. Over time, it starts to really create an imbalance. So the price, this is just how we are wired to cope with the fast-paced lifestyle that we are being asked to live, is put certain needs on a pedestal and just completely ignore certain other needs. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to highlight
that also creates difficulties in connection, because then we start to delegitimize other people's needs. It's like, that's not so important for me. Right. And I can do this very unconsciously. I can do it consciously, or I can do it very unconsciously. That just doesn't feel as important to me. And so it's easy for me to not even recognize that I think that that's less important, and to just not think about another person's need, which is important to them.
Okay, so we've talked about needs. We've talked about the definition of strategies. How do people confuse needs and strategies, and how can we tell the difference between what a need is and what a strategy is?
How can people confuse needs and strategies? That's just natural when we don't actually understand the difference, which very few of us do, and which I did not before studying NVC. I didn't understand the difference. Theoretically, maybe some element, but it was not very clear and operational, that's for sure. So we think, well, I need this. One of the classic expressions, I mean, there are many versions of this. It's like, I need you to do this for me. You're already betraying that you don't understand what a need is when you say that. Rasanath, I need you to give me validation. I need you to acknowledge me. No. So I have a need of acknowledgement. I have a need for acknowledgement. But when I say I need you, that's a strategy to meet my need. Now you become the proxy for my inability to meet my own need. And this is foundational for NVC, that we are all responsible for meeting our own needs. And we don't get to objectify other people and then blame them for not meeting our needs. Other people do not exist to meet our needs. They are not objects in our world. And this is very aligned with the upbuild philosophy, that we do not see other people as a means to meet my needs, nor do we hold them responsible for not doing so. Of course, there are also nuances to this, and there are ways in which that can be abused. And there are things that there are natural norms in relationships. But the way NVC talks about that, which I find very beneficial, is in terms of agreements. Agreements that I want to help you meet your need in this way, as opposed to you must, and if you didn't, you're bad and you're wrong. And so the strategy is, Rasanath, you're supposed to validate me. You're supposed to give me the acknowledgement that I need. That's my strategy. And I'm saying, I need you to do this. And if you don't do it, then it's a problem. Like, you're in the wrong, you're bad, you're wrong. I create enemy images of you. And it's your fault. And now there's the rift, right? Subtly or grossly, there's a rift. And we're doing this in little ways all the time. We're doing this in little ways all the time. We conflate needs with strategies. And our strategies are to control other people, again, using the understanding of the ego and how we control other people to get the validation of who I think I should be. That's exactly the problem. Those strategies don't work, and they're not needs. Our needs are real. We have to meet our needs. We're going about it in the wrong way. And when we conflate needs with strategies, we're guaranteed to create confusion, difficulty, and dissatisfaction for ourselves and others.
So in the example that you shared, I need you to give me validation, Rasanath. The reason why the need might be recognition or appreciation, even validation in some respect.
Yes.
But because you're demanding essentially that Rasanath give it to you, then it becomes on the level of strategy. Also, that example, there's different levels of healthy strategy, of asking for healthy strategies versus less healthy ones. It occurred to me that yours was actually straightforward, and there was some honesty about, you used the word need, and maybe it's more, I want you to give me validation, or I would appreciate if you could give me some validation. But there are much less healthy ways that people go about this. So we might say at work, like, I need you to give me a raise, or if somebody doesn't respond to my email in an hour after I've sent something that I think deserves, a bunch of smiley face emojis or a heart emoji or some claps in some sort of way, and I get upset about that, and I say I need you to respond to, or I feel that I need somebody else to respond more quickly to the things that I send, that's even one level less honest about what the real need is, which again goes back to appreciation and recognition and validation. But there are just certain strategies that I'm locking them into in order to get that need met.
Yeah. So NVC doesn't go into like different levels of health the way that we do. We talk about different levels of consciousness or awareness and how much we're in touch with ourselves versus how much we're disconnected from ourselves, and the output being disconnecting and not helping, not constructive. And the interesting thing is, yes, that these strategies do exist on different levels of consciousness, depending on my consciousness, my awareness, my connection to myself. I'm going to develop strategies that correlate, and strategies that disconnect or connect accordingly. Interestingly, when I say, Rasanath, I need you to do this for me, even if it's a legitimate need, I'm now making my need a demand. And NVC talks about needs versus demands. And as soon as it's a demand, it's violent. It's because there's an or else attached to it. If you don't, I'm going to try to make you suffer. Again, consciously or unconsciously, I'm going to be angry with you. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. There's a desperate attempt to make you feel the consequence of not meeting my need. And that's the violence. And that's what makes it a demand. I'm remembering Marshall Rosenberg in a workshop. He once said, how do we know if this is a need or a demand? It depends on how you reacted the last time that need was not fulfilled. I think that's brilliant. So if you had a big reaction that was really trying to make somebody pay for not meeting your need, then it's a demand. But if it's a genuine attempt to have a need met and you're asking for support, then you're on the level of needs.
Okay, I appreciate this distinction between request and demand here.
Yes,
understanding when something is a demand. As soon as you attach a person to it, it can very subtly become, or not so subtly become, a demand.
Exactly. And we'll speak more about requests at another time in this series. But yes, that's exactly it. How can I tell if I'm trying to meet my need through a humble, sincere request, or if it's a demand? That's very telling.
One of the reasons why the conflation between needs and strategies happens is it's very fundamental. When we come in touch with our needs, we feel vulnerable, and we also feel needy. And there is a lot of shame around that, right? Subconscious and unconsciously, we feel extremely dependent and needy. And so now, what's the way to cope with it? Right? I suddenly realized that if I am needy, the responsibility is all on me, which in one sense is true. And we'll talk about, how, again, in the levels of consciousness that we talk about, typically, the idea to climb up the levels of consciousness is learning how to take responsibility, relentlessly taking responsibility. But what happens when we feel so overwhelmed by our quote unquote neediness is we shift the responsibility. And that's what a strategy is. And it happens so unconsciously and so automatically. Now the responsibility for my need shifts to somebody else. And the way I convey it a demand usually has the tone of it's your responsibility, versus when you are just expressing a need, the tone is it's the need is my responsibility. The need is mine, and that is wholly my responsibility. And that's the big distinction I see from a point of view of mindset in how we convey our need.
There's heart to our needs. They're in our hearts. And when they come out, when we express them in a genuine way that's true to them, there's heart to it. And there's even vulnerability there. But when we make it a demand, it's really a way of saving face, as you're talking about, Rasanath. It's a way of avoiding the shame that I have needs, because we're conditioned to think that if I have needs, exactly as you said, therefore I'm needy, therefore I'm lesser. And nonviolent communication turns that on its head, says, no, we have to embrace the fact that we have needs. We are born with needs, and they're good. They're life energy that is seeking fulfillment. And to ignore them or pretend we don't have them or pawn them off on other people doesn't help. It's not in line with our being. Actually, the needs, as we understand it at Upbuild, they come from the true self. They come from the self. And what we're doing with our strategies is trying to meet them on the level of the ego, a projection of who we think we should be. And so it never really fulfills. And the strategy is not, it's not the problem. The strategy, like having strategies, is never a problem. Strategies are good. But are the strategies effective? Are they grounded in understanding myself and the other person? Are they gone about in a reasonable way with consideration for myself and the other? Do they relate to the real me? Or am I trying to get an image validated? Am I trying to get connection in a way that is based on a phantom version of myself? So that's what we have to look at. But when we have healthy strategies from an Upbuild vantage point, we're connected with ourselves and we're genuinely trying to connect with the other, and we're honest about our needs.
I just also wanted to remark that, sorry, Michael, did you?
I was just gonna reflect back, Rasanath, what you shared about feeling so vulnerable in sharing that I have needs. Like, this is not easy work, because we really do need courage in order to see that we have needs. And depending on who we are, some people might be very in touch with their needs, and a lot of people are not. And as you said, it makes us feel needy when we admit to having needs, and nobody likes to feel needy, especially if we're having trouble getting those needs met. I spent 11 years on a trading floor at an investment bank, and I cannot imagine walking around talking about how I have a need for connection, or a need for intimacy, or a need for a deep sense of security. Like, these are just not ways that we communicate in our everyday language and in our everyday conversations with people. So just to highlight the fact that this is not easy work and takes a lot of courage.
Well, that's also where, thank you. And that's also where the violence starts, is we violate ourselves first, right? We minimize ourselves first. We have to censure, we have to suppress. But they don't necessarily get suppressed. They just get expressed in lesser healthy ways. Needs don't go away. They just find ways to leak out, disguised as something else. So any form of violence that we inflict on somebody else has its roots in how we treat ourselves. And then we treat ourselves as quote unquote needy people, which means when we need to censure ourselves from legitimately understanding our own needs, then it's natural that they will leak out into the environment in ways that will harm other people.
Censoring ourselves, like like blocking out the things that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So there's an acronym P.L.A.T.O, which I'd love to get into now, which can be so helpful in differentiating needs from strategies. Hari, could you take us into that?
Yeah, I love this. I think it's genius. Like Marshall Rosenberg has really given us such an invaluable language, once again, or a language within the language. Plato is the means by which we can distinguish needs from strategies. And this is crucial, right? Because if we conflate a need with a strategy, we can't meet the need properly. We create the disconnect. We have to understand, we have to be connected with ourselves. That means we have to know that, like, I need a coffee is not a need. What am I seeking in that coffee? Or I need alcohol, right? Like an alcoholic will think, I need alcohol. We're all addicts of different kinds. Figure out what you're addicted to, and then figure out the need behind it. And you can lessen the addiction. You can wean yourself off of it. So Plato is meant to distinguish, to give us this intelligence. In the yoga tradition, the word is buddhi, the ability to discriminate, the ability to discern, to see what is really what is happening, so that we can be conscious and connected with reality. And so Plato is the acronym that means people, location, action, time, or object. Plato, people, location, action, time, or object. If your need, so-called need, is attached to any one of these, rest assured, it is not a need. It is a strategy. This is our intelligence. This is our buddhi, to distinguish between a need and a strategy. If it's attached to any one of these, like in the example, I need you, Rasanath, you're a person, people, violation, wrong, it's not a need. If it has an object attached to it, coffee, I need coffee, wrong, not a need. No, what's behind that? What's the need behind your seeking out the coffee? This will be very illuminating. You'll really start to get somewhere. So people, location, well, it has to be in this place, or time. It has to be at this time. It has to have this action to it. Any of those are actually revealing that something is a strategy instead of the real thing that I'm deeply seeking fulfillment about. I don't know what is seeking fulfillment. It's not that the coffee is seeking fulfillment, or the caffeine bloodstream, the need in my blood is for coffee. It's not like that.
Yeah, there's something deeper at play there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so as soon as Plato is so helpful because it tells us what specifics do we need to look out for that would cause something to move into the realm of strategy as opposed to need. And one of the things that I noticed, Hari, when you were sharing the examples of needs earlier on, is that almost all of them are one word.
Yeah. Very good.
And coffee's one word too, but what we mean there is I need to drink coffee. Right.
Yeah.
So just because it's one word does not mean it is. Just because it is one word does not mean it is definitely a need. But almost all of the needs, some of them I think have hyphens in them.
Yeah, well, like shared reality is a term, and that's a genuine need. So it's not that they're all going to be one word, but they're succinct. They're very clear, and actually, many of them, if not most of them, are really just one.
Right, and the key thing here is that they're not tied to specifics. And P, people, L, location, A, action, T, time, and O, object. The acronym P.L.A.T.O. give us a sense of what the specifics might be that would cause it to be a strategy.
Yeah, and when we bond with people on the level of strategies, that's sometimes nice. But really, the heart is not moved by, oh, you do this strategy also? Wow, we have so much in common. You can feel how we're not yet going to the satisfaction of the heart. Again, relationships are an exchange of emotions, and strategies can bring emotions, but the way that we talk about strategies is not bringing the level of emotion that the heart is seeking, whereas needs do. When I feel you've met my need to be seen, that's a term, the need to be seen. When I feel you've met that need for me to be seen, when I feel seen by you, that brings up an emotion that's very different from, oh, you jog also? Amazing. Nice. We both like jogging. Cool. Totally different. It's not intrinsic. It has nothing to do with the self. Of course, the self is active and the self, we need to be in a healthy body. And there is a way in which we may be seeking stimulation or aliveness or something, adventure, and jogging is helpful for that. But it's only when we start seeing what the jogging is bringing me that the bonding with other people goes much deeper.
So if I say I have a need for jogging or a need to go for a run with my partner, let's say, and this actually is somewhat of a personal example. My partner and I have had conflicts about this because in the beginning of our relationship, so much of what we shared was exercise. And that's become much less of a thing in our relationship in the last couple of years. And I've experienced a lot of dissatisfaction as a result of that. And I've paraded around things like, hey, in the beginning it was like this. And so I need to actually do these kinds of activities with you. And it caused conflict. So speaking on the level of strategy there was actually the conflict. And what would have been more helpful, what I'm seeing from this conversation, is talking about things like intimacy or connection, or even to feeling like I need to feel understood and be seen, because exercise is such a core part of my life. I feel like if my partner, and this is where I went a little bit amiss, but if my partner chose to do those activities with me, then she would be seeing me and understanding who I really am. But the need there is to be seen and understood. And then it's possible to actually brainstorm. And if she's not able to do that in this phase of life for whatever reason, it's actually possible to have a healthier conversation where we brainstorm other ways for both of us to agree on how we can get that need met for me.
Fantastic. You see how this opens up freedom. When we get to the level of the need, there is freedom. When we get to the level of strategy, it's constriction. Freedom versus constriction. If we're operating on the level of strategy, it's constriction, constraint, blame, upset. But if we're talking on the level of need, we have creativity, we have freedom, we have ways. How many ways? There are so many different ways to meet any need. It just requires that we get to that level and engage on that level. So like Michael, how could you feel understood?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways. This feels like a very vulnerable question, but I'm going to take a stab at it. If somebody inquires about the work that I do, because the work that I do is also very important to me. So to have somebody interested in that, which only takes, a block of time and some sincere questioning. If somebody asks me what would make today a great day for me, and then actively tries to have a conversation around that. If somebody asks me what's important to me in my life, and we're able to have a conversation around that. So what I'm seeing here is if somebody takes an interest in what's really important to me, then that helps me feel seen and understood. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we then have to go execute on any of those things, but it's just the interest in the first place.
Beautiful, beautiful. And when it's so dependent on the external thing, it actually starts to cheapen it. Like when you get to that level of depth, you can feel the satisfaction. And it's like, yes, it would be great if we also make an action out of it. That's wonderful to create a strategy that works. But like the level of connection is so much bigger than the way in which we try to action on something. And this is what's happening all the time in all of our relationships is we're conflating needs with strategies and getting hung up and tied up and feeling our freedom restricted, feeling like victims, blaming consciously and unconsciously. That can't be emphasized enough. And that was such a beautiful, and thank you for sharing so honestly and vulnerably, because it's such a beautiful insight and a very real way of understanding this.
It is a lot for a partner, because many times in a partnership, in an intimate relationship, uh, we expect the other person to carry and meet us on all our strategies, really, which is a lot to carry. And when we go down to the level of needs, there is also freedom. You begin to recognize that, yeah, this person, given what they are doing, their stage of life, their own needs, may not be able to meet all of my needs. But as soon as I put pressure on them to meet all of my needs, it's a lot for that relationship to carry at any stage.
Marshall Rosenberg has a really intense term for that, a violent term for that. He calls it emotional slavery. When I expect you to meet my needs, that is emotional slavery. And when you expect me to meet your needs, that is emotional slavery. And we're walking around doing this all the time without even knowing it. And the only way to break free is by taking responsibility, not playing the victim, but actually breaking out and saying, you know what, I have these needs. I have to figure out how to fulfill them. If you could help me, that would be great. And the help is on your terms. Of course, we create agreements so that it also matches my terms. I'm not negating myself. I'm not pretending that my terms don't matter, but we have to meet each other. Then there's freedom.
Beautiful. One of the last questions that I usually like to ask is, well, what's at stake if we don't take on what we're talking about? And you've just done a beautiful job at articulating that. We do not want to put each other into emotional slavery. And that's what we're doing on a daily basis, even an hour-to-hour basis, when we're communicating with the people that we love the most, that we appreciate and are closest to in our lives. And this framework is so helpful in illuminating how we might be doing that and what we can do instead.
Well, it also puts a mirror when we say that these are the people that we love the most. Perhaps we loved them because they met our strategies, right? And it's so important to recognize how easy it is for us to reduce the term love to a transaction, because ultimately meeting a strategy is a transaction. And we love someone because they met our strategies. But then it also opens us to ask the question, well, did I really actually love someone? And this is what it does. It actually truly gives you the freedom to love, which otherwise is just filled with, well, who can fulfill my strategy? And we call that love.
Yeah, that's the ego objectifying people, because I'm the subject and everybody else exists in my world to meet my needs the way that I want them to, using my strategies, or else.
So in this episode, we covered the introduction to the framework. We talked a lot about the difference between violent and nonviolent communication and how much of our communication is violent, even if we're not always paying attention to that fact. And then we talked about needs, strategies, how to tell the difference between needs and strategies, the acronym P.L.A.T.O, people, location, action, time, and object, which could be such a helpful acronym in helping us see when we might be parading our needs as strategies. And we talked about how we can actually take responsibility for our own needs and communicate in a healthier way while enrolling other people in meeting our needs. So that was episode 1. We have more to cover in the rest of the series, which I'm really looking forward to. Is there anything that either of you would share in closing?
I think you have really summarized it very well. I gave myself a little time to think about it, and I think you've summarized it very, very well. There is no need. There is no personal need. Summarize. Thank you.
Thank you.
I love it, Michael. Yeah, I love the way you've captured it. I would just ask people, if you're listening, please make this commitment to yourself that you're going to free yourself and others from the emotional slavery of expecting other people to meet your needs by your strategies. Take responsibility and release people and release yourself. It will be so satisfying if you can just make that conscious commitment and say, I'm going to get to know what it is that I need beyond my strategies, and I'm going to enlist other people's support in helping me meet my needs without a demand attached to it. But I'm really going to get to know myself, and I'm really trying to I'm going to really try to live connected with myself. That is so powerful, and you will feel so much more connection to other people. So if you just make that commitment, that is huge, monumental.
Thank you, Hari Prasad, and thank you, Rasanath. It was great to be with you guys for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, everyone, for listening.